So welcome everyone to our STAMPS webinar series. We're very fortunate to have Murali Haran here today. Murali is professor and head of Department of Statistics at Penn State University. He has a PhD in statistics from the University of Minnesota. And as I was happy to just find out, he's also a Carnegie Mellon alumni with a bachelor's in computer science with minors in stats, math, and film studies. Murali is a leading expert and researcher in the intersection of algorithms and statistical probability models. His research interests include Monte Carlo algorithms, spatial models, and statistical analysis of complex computer models. Murali is also known for his interdisciplinary research in climate science and infectious disease modeling. Murali has received both the Young Researcher Award from the International Parametric Society, as well as the Young Investigator Award from American Statistical Association, both to recognize and honor his outstanding contributions to environmental statistics. So today, Murali is going to give a talk on statistical methods for ice sheet model calibration. So maybe I can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Anne, and Mikhail and Nick for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. So let me just plunge right in to talking about ice sheets. So just to give you a little bit of motivation, in case you don't already have enough motivation to be interested in ice sheets. Ice sheets are quite an enormous mass of ice. And I have put up a picture here of Antarctic, the Antarctic ice sheet, which is this entire thing that's in white, and you can see I overlaid the map. I didn't do this. This is a NASA figure that I plucked, and it overlaid the map of the entire continental U.S. and it fits quite nicely into this enormous ice sheet, and it's also incredibly thick. And in fact, just to give you a sense of how much water this contains, the Antarctic ice sheet has the equivalent of 58 meters of sea level rise. So if the entire ice sheet were to melt, then sea level around the world would rise by 58 meters. So that's just gives you a sense of the incredible amount of volume. The Greenland ice sheet is not it's not small, but that's only 6 meters, would result in, only within quotes 6 meters of sea level rise. And the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets together contain over 99% of the freshwater ice in the world. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of just how incredibly big these things are. And then just to bring home the point that there are impacts that one might worry about. So in particular, this is to get you to think about storm surges when you have a hurricane. So if the sea level, even if it doesn't rise an incredible amount, if it rises just a little bit, the storm surge is something that's added on top of that. So whatever you have as protections that this person in this picture is sort of is looking over at this menacing body of water coming here, those protections may or may not be adequate depending on what additional sea level rise you have to contend with when you have a storm surge. So there are definitely, that's just one example of a major impact from the melting of the ice sheets. So if you want to start with thinking about where this starts, if you're thinking about rising global temperatures, that impacts ice sheet melt, and that in turn can lead to sea level rise. And what I'm going to be focusing on in the talk today is entirely this guy. So I'm going to assume that this piece, the rising global temperatures, and essentially the giant models that one works with to study things like global temperatures, general circulation models and such, I'm going to treat those as outside the purview of this problem. I'm going to focus entirely on the ice sheet models here, and treat the other stuff as given. And this is a complicated enough problem, as you will soon find out. Okay. So just to start off with some perspective, I'm quoting the legendary applied mathematician Ed Lorenz, MIT applied mathematician and meteorologist. Ed Lorenz, he said in 1970 that formulating reasonable hypotheses regarding climatic change requires physical insight and ingenuity, but subsequently testing these hypotheses demands quantitative computation, which I think is a very nice way of summarizing where we're at in studying things like ice sheets. So my translation, which is just restating this in the context of climate here, in terms that all of us will recognize. So to study future climate, we need physical models, data, and statistics. So statistical thinking, and then the physical models. So that's the physical insight has been translated into physical models, and the quantitative computation is you need data and then statistical methods, and then you need to do something. Generally, you need to innovate on these fronts to do anything interesting. And I'm going to focus, as I said a moment ago, on studying the West Antarctic ice sheet. So the talk summary. So how can we understand the dynamics of the ice sheet and project its future behavior? So there are many ways to do this. I'm going to focus on exactly one way, which is to focus on the ice sheet model of Pollard and DeConto. And you can have many different references to this because it's been updated over the years. It's a very well-known ice sheet model, and Dave Pollard is a long-term collaborator of mine at Penn State, and he's one of the world's leading ice sheet modelers. So we start off with this model, which basically describes the physics, the dynamics of ice sheets. And then we look at we note that there are certain parameters in this model that govern the model behavior. And here's the key word. So they're uncertain, meaning that people have some idea of what those values might be, but they don't really know what they are. And if you change them, you affect the behavior of the ice sheet model. So the plan here is to use model runs and observations to learn about these parameters. And essentially, in the title of my talk, I use the word calibration, and you can simply summarize, this is calibration. So this is using model runs plus observations to learn about these parameters. Okay. And I've added there that model runs are computationally expensive in general. For this particular model, they're expensive. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But that really plays a major role in the kinds of methods we develop. Okay. So when we're trying to get a handle on this problem, we have to consider several trade-offs. This is very common in physical, in building models like this and calibrating them. So the first one is to think about model resolution. So in particular, you might think about the temporal resolution. So how often you'd like the model to put stuff out. If it's modeling something that's a process that evolves over time, which is the case with the ice sheets. Or spatial resolution, which is to tell you how resolved you want this to be in space. So if you want it at a very fine scale or something much coarser. So that decision also impacts computational time, because if you ask for higher resolution, you will end up having something that's more computationally complex. And that in turn impacts the number of parameters you can study. So if you decide to have a model that's very expensive, so it's very high resolution and it's very expensive to run, then it's unlikely that you'd be able to study how the model responds as you vary lots of parameters, because the space on which you need to study this would involve running the model repeatedly at many different parameter value settings. And it's difficult if the model is that complex and computationally demanding to run it often enough to be able to study lots of parameters. So these are some of the important trade-offs here. So what I'm going to do in this talk is essentially give an overview and contrast two methods for this problem. One is Gaussian process emulation calibration, and the other is calibration via particle-based or otherwise sequential Monte Carlo. And I've specifically said overview because the plan isn't to get into heavy details here, because I know this is a very broad audience. And if you're interested in the details, you can always follow up by taking a look at some of the papers that this talk is based on. But I would like to take this as an opportunity to give you the big picture and a sense of these two methods and how they fit in. So before I go any further, I should really begin with discussing, giving you a quick glimpse of what an ice sheet model has to handle, the kind of physics you'd have to think through. Essentially, so this is a nice cartoon stolen from the Earth Institute at Columbia. And so the ice sheet dynamics essentially system of PDEs that end up being translated into computer code, and they're complex enough that you do not don't think that you can ever get any analytical grip on this model. So your only hope of studying it is by simulating from it. So so there's several uncertain parameters that drive the dynamics, and I will talk about that in a minute. But from this cartoon, you can see that some of the actors on this ice sheet. So this thing that's all white. This is your ice sheet, and you can see that there's a part of it that's a shelf, and it's hanging over the water, and you can see that this thing is particularly vulnerable, and at some point, some part of it might just break off into an iceberg, and so you can imagine that there are processes that govern how vulnerable this guy is, and how much this ice shelf is impacted by the warm ocean water that it's right up against. So you might have a parameter that dictates that behavior, its response to the warm ocean water, and its tendency to break off. So this is the word that people use for this is calving, C-A-L-V-I-N-G. So that's one process, and then you have how the ice sheet comes to being in the first place. You have precipitation, so this process, and just an enormous amount of it over time, accumulating over time, and it starts stacking up and building up, and it's very thick, and oops, I hear some echo here. And it's very thick, and you can see there are forces of gravity that act this way, and then the ice sheet itself will begin, the different layers start to slide in this direction, right? And so all of these forces then are also impacted by the temperature. So the precipitation, the temperature, the ocean water, and then the forces that interact with and are within this mass of ice then dictate how the ice sheet evolves over time. And all of this is described by these ice sheet modelers. And for instance, in Pollard and DeConto's PSU 3D ice model. So this is sort of a nice cartoon version of the model. And so where do we come into the picture? Well, there are many of these parameters that I sort of hinted at on the previous cartoon that then appear as essentially, and I purposely, as a former computer science major, I found it useful to just point out, look, they appear as constants in your computer model, right? So right up in the top of your computer code, you have these things in all bold, and they're fixed to being certain values. And then you fix those values, and then you run the model. But it turns out that these parameters, if you tweak them, you change the values a little bit in one way or another way, they start having an impact on how the ice sheet evolves over time. and how it responds to the changing climate. So trying to get a handle on what these values are, and in particular, what the uncertainties surrounding these values might be, is important. And so how do we do that? Well, we use observations. So examples of observations are satellite data of the modern ice sheet. So this is the easiest one to think of. So this just tells you the extent of the ice sheet, and that's of course one nice way to calibrate your model, right? So you would like your model runs to look like the ice sheet, the modern ice sheet looks like right now. So that's sort of a way to get the model, get the parameters to be calibrated to the modern ice sheet. But it turns out that that's, of course, you can imagine if you have essentially one point that's a small snapshot of the behavior of something that's millions of years old. This is not something that is going to really constrain the parameters very well. You're only going to learn so much. And in particular, so I pointed out a few of these parameters. So some parameters apply to processes that have occurred in the past and are expected to occur in the future, but are not active today. So for example, here's a parameter, this tau ASTH, which is a timescale of bedrock rebound under varying ice loads. So this is kind of a fun one. It basically says that if you really, for instance, dramatically reduce the ice load, so there's a lot of melt that happens, then the bedrock, how quickly it rebounds as a response to, you got ice, a massive amount of ice stacked on it. If it melts quickly, how quickly it rebounds is actually, there's a parameter that dictates that in the model. And you cannot learn about that if you don't actually have an opportunity to include information about a major change in the ice load. So you need information going far back, or you have processes that are undergoing rapid change in recent decades. And so if you just look at one snapshot, it's very hard for you to get enough information about this. So for example, coefficients for ocean melting at the base of the floating ice shelves. So this is something I pointed to in that cartoon. And so these are two examples of parameters for which you would really like to use some information. So reconstructions of past ice sheet behavior. So you need that information as well. And here are just a couple of examples. So information about the extent of the ice sheet from the last, or the volume of the ice sheet from the last interglacial period, which is 115 to 125,000 years ago. And then grounding line data. So this is where, to which point the ice sheet has retreated since the last glacial maximum, where the ice sheets were really at their maximum, which is about 25,000 years ago. So that's also sort of a time series data. So some kind of information on where the grounding line has been over the years. So these are examples of ways in which you can capture some information about the past ice sheet behavior, which then helps you learn about these parameters, which you would probably not be able to learn about otherwise. But if you need to know something about those parameters to say something sensible about your model today, and both to understand the present and the future of the ice sheet. All right, so now, again, because I'm speaking to a broad audience, but sometimes I find this useful to discuss this with every audience, is maybe it's useful to step back and say, why should you use probability modeling here? And let me explain why I'm posing this question. So it turns out that there are lots of extremely bright people who work in ice sheet modeling who don't work with statisticians, or who have not gone out and gotten training in statistics any more than we have gone out and gotten training in ice sheet modeling. But they're very clever, and they come up with fairly sensible informal approaches to learn about the parameters. So here's one example that's quite common. So you find the parameter values that produce model output that's within some threshold of the observation. So you got some metric, and you say, I'm going to run the model at lots of parameter settings, and the ones that are within a certain distance of the that produce model output that's within a certain distance of my observations, those are the ones I declare to be winners. And, and maybe I can even have different weights depending on how close they are. And then I can do something with that, right? And lots of people do fairly sensible things with this, but this is not using the language of probability at all. So why should we use probability models? So I feel like it's useful for us to often remind ourselves as well as our scientific collaborators why there might be some value in it, because maybe sometimes there may not be that much value in it. So here are a few reasons. So if I go through a Bayesian approach, which I'm going to describe, to do inference for this, the posterior distributions of the parameters, so what I've learned about the parameters, given all the assumptions and the data I have, they end up being easier to interpret rather than this parameter was within this, gave me model output that was within blah of the observations. That's awkward. It's a lot nicer to say, given all the data we have and our assumptions, the probability that this parameter is greater than 1.4 is 0.1. That gives you some way of talking about things that is also ends up being very useful if you're going to compare the results across resolutions. So the number of decisions you have to make when you're working on a complicated problem like this is quite immense. So you have to decide the resolution of the model, the kinds of data that you use, the resolution at which you get the data, so whether you want to aggregate things. And you would like to be able to compare, if you do more than one approach, if you want to compare them, it's a lot cleaner to compare them if you can talk about things in the language of probability. Also turns out that you don't really want to assume that your model for some parameter setting will give you something that looks like the observations. We all know with these physical models that even the best ones are often systematically off from the true observations. And this is over and above observational error. You don't really think that we're so brilliant that we can figure out exactly how an ice sheet has evolved over time. You can get close, but you often have systematic errors. And so if you have a probabilistic way of doing this, you can actually write down models for this, and you can account for observational errors, approximation errors, and all those things. And you can lay down those assumptions and argue about the assumptions, which it's a lot easier to do that if you have the language of probability. And then if you want to make projections, this is very useful. If you want to make projections about sea level rise, then you would like probability distributions about those sea level rise projections. And it's easy to do that if you have probability distributions about the parameters that are then used to drive those sea level rise, right? So it's a simple simple sampling problem that if you have the distribution on the parameters that drive the model, then you can get a distribution on the model output. So that's also very nice. And finally, if you want to study the relationships between parameters, that's also very easy to do when you use a probability model. And any one of you who's worked with complex models knows that our models are always more ambitious than the data that we have. At least every problem I've ever worked on. And you have identifiability issues, and you'd like to find out which combinations of these parameters yield the same kind of behavior. It's a lot easier to do that when you have probability distributions. You can look at how elliptic, how the marginal bivariate marginals might look, for example. And then this is just a comment. This is not the most important one, but in practice, I found that I've gotten results that are sort of sharper. That there's just more information that I get, but that's just something that I found. I'm not willing to stand by that as much as I'm willing to stand by all these others. Okay, so here's a quick example from one of our past, from our research group's past papers. And this is just a quick illustration. On the left is something that one of our ice sheet modelers was doing, which is the reds were the parameter settings that gave you something that was really good, and then the black. So this is on. Sorry, I'm not pointing out to this. So here we're over here. So these red dots, these guys correspond to good parameter settings by some thresholding approach. And then the blue crosses are not so great parameter settings. And so if you look at the figure on the left, that tells you something. And you can see that it's sort of related to the thing on the right, but not quite. The thing on the right here, this is actually bivariate marginal posterior distributions, each of these things. So dark red means really it's a peak. And it turns out in this case that because we put in stuff about discrepancies and systematic errors, we're able to get something that's a much sharper picture, and then it's also easier to interpret. Okay, so now let's talk about model complexity. Ice sheet models vary in complexity, so they're and the key drivers of this complexity are spatial and temporal resolution, as I discussed before, and there are simple models, which some people in our group use these models, which simplify or exclude important physical processes in the ice sheet dynamics. And the nice thing about them is the runtime is only a few seconds. So you can do a lot with these models because they're very fast. But then you have something that's more complex and sophisticated, like this PAC 3D ice model. And it better represents key ice dynamics, can provide higher resolution, spatio-temporal resolution. But the big problem is that it can take hours or days to run at each setting. Hence, it's difficult to study the behavior of the model, and as you vary the parameter settings. So in our case, it's hard for us to do anything more than about 4 to 6 parameters. So here are two. Having set that stage for handling model complexity, for thinking about model complexity, here are two approaches that our group worked on. In both cases, we ran the same model, so it's got a fairly sophisticated representation of ice dynamics. The only thing that we did differently was, in one case, the resolution used was much higher than in the other case. Okay, so here's the one approach, which is to use a high resolution, a horizontal resolution of 20 kilometers, and this takes several hours per model run. And so this is a case where the model is complicated enough that we cannot simply just run it wherever we like at 10 different parameter settings. So we selected 4 that were considered particularly important, and then they were still expensive enough that we handled the computing by model emulation, which I'm going to discuss. So this is an approximation approach, where you approximate the computer model. And the other approach was to use coarse resolution, which is a horizontal resolution of 80 kilometers, which takes 10 to 15 minutes per model run. And so this is much, much faster. And so this allows us to use pretty good dynamics, but still allows for better exploration. So it's a certain compromise. And now we can actually consider 11 parameters that are deemed to be quite important or interesting. But computation costs are still high. So we needed to come up with something that would allow us to address the computation cost, but without doing emulation, which it turns out does not work very well as you increase the dimensions of the problem. So these approaches strike different compromises. And I'm going to basically talk you through the framework for both of these approaches, and then a little bit about the details for them. Okay, so here's the framework. So here's your model parameter. This is the thing we're interested in learning about. And then forcings, these are the external forcings. These are things like the temperature of the ocean water as it comes up against the ice sheet, precipitation, things like that. So this goes into the model as well as this model parameter. That goes into this computer model, which actually is tells you how the ice sheet dynamics works. And then when you run the model, you get the model output for that particular theta. So you notice that, so why is what I observe a model output, something multivariate, and it's at theta, so it's indexed by theta. And now this is sort of the thought process. We say that model output plus some model discrepancies. So this is some systematic departure between what the model is supposed to do and what the model does and what we observe. so that's delta in our model. And then observation error, which is just telling you how messy the observations are, measurement error and other things. And so if you put all of that together, you get your observation, Z. So now, given this setup, we now look at, if we can write down a model for all of this, then we can go back essentially to just basic statistical inference. If I have a model for Z, given all the information that I have from here, then basically I can back out theta based on what I've written down for my model and the observations I have. Okay, so if I were to just summarize this thing in the simplest terms, I would just do this guy down here. Z is equal to y of theta, and the theta is red because that's the thing that we're interested in. Okay, so with calibration, so I've just rewritten this model here again. So this is the same model here. The inferences then, I'm going to use a Bayes approach for this problem. The inference works as follows. I write down a prior for my parameters that go into this model, and then I have a likelihood function. And this likelihood function is determined by this model, right? And if I have this likelihood function and a prior, I can get my posterior distribution for the parameters that I'm interested in. And in particular, notice that this parameter I can get as a marginal distribution if I integrate out all the other things, the other nuisance parameters. So this is just a quick overview of calibration. So if you wanted to do this in a standard way, you might just say, well, this is a posterior distribution, and you can just use a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm that has this posterior distribution as a stationary distribution. And this MCMC would work well even if your parameters are fairly high dimensional. So this is not a difficult problem, except that this likelihood evaluation involves running the model, right? So if you wanted to look at what y of theta is, you have to run it for each theta. So now you can imagine, if for those of you who constructed MCMC algorithms, at each step of your Metropolis Hastings, you're going to have a proposal and then evaluate things based on running the computer model. Imagine that this now takes hours. That's of course not possible at all. But even if it took 15 minutes, this is not going to work very well in practice. So here's our first approach. So our first approach is essentially to recognize that this y of theta is a nuisance in that it's very time consuming. So we take this guy and we essentially replace it by a fast stochastic approximation. And in case you just end up glossing over all what I discussed briefly about this fast stochastic approximation, what it is essentially treating this like a non-parametric regression that says, I'm going to find a relationship between theta and y of theta. So that if you give me a new theta, I can make a prediction for y at that new theta. Okay, so that's the quick view of what that is. So emulation calibration. So what we did in our project was we studied only the 4 parameters, and note that the remaining are fixed at values depending on past studies and expertise. And then we use emulation calibration to learn about these parameters. So the first step here is emulation, where we find this fast approximation. As I said, it's kind of like doing a non-parametric regression. It might be like a functional regression because the output that you get is often multivariate. Your response, y of theta, is multivariate, right? But it's basically like a regression, a flexible regression. And the calibration step is where you infer the climate parameter using the emulator and observation. So you take the original model and you replace it with this approximation that we obtained from this step, and you're off to the races. And then this is just a small detail. Some people might wonder, why not do it all together? There's some really good arguments for why you split it into 2 steps. It's both computational and some inferential advantages. So I put a couple of references here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Murali, there's a question here from Michael Stein. I think it might be on slide 16.
Yeah.
That says, aren't there substantial uncertainties in the forcings as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Who's measuring ocean temperature below the ice sheets?
Absolutely. So, when I early on when I had my cartoon showing that you have essentially global temperature and other things, and then you have, well, actually I can just go back to this cartoon here. I'm not handling this. I'm treating these things as known, and the uncertainties there are huge. So absolutely, that this is a classic problem with systems like this. We're being very ambitious, trying to understand how ice sheets work, and even handling the piece that I'm handling now. There's lots of things that we have to assume, but honestly, the pieces that are outside of this are even greater. So the answer to that is yes. We're not studying the uncertainty in the forcings. Yeah. Okay. Fit the flexible model relating parameter to model output. Yeah. So Gaussian process emulations to fit the flexible model relating the parameter to model output. So it's a simple idea. So we just want a model that's simple and easy to evaluate or simulate from. And so that the model allows for approximation uncertainty, which means that if we think that there are certain places where the emulation or the approximation is going to perform worse than in other places, that we sort of account for that. Also that so the model is stochastic, so it's useful for inference down the road. And so basically we work with, as I said before, you can just think of this as a non-parametric regression. So you run the model at p parameter settings. So theta 1 through theta p, and y of theta at theta 1 to y of theta p. And you fit a Gaussian process to this. So for a Gaussian process in an infinite dimensional process, where every finite set of these things has jointly a multivariate normal distribution with some covariance. Right? And essentially the idea is that once you fit this Gaussian process model to these model runs, then you have a probability model that allows you to do the following, which is, it says for any new value of theta, you can figure out a probability model for that. You can write down a probability distribution for any new value of theta on y. So, and here's a toy example. So where the model output is a scalar and continuous, and you observe these are the values that you observe, and you interpolate. The Gaussian process interpolates like this, and so sorry, the black curve is the true model, but we only get to observe it at these at where the black dots are observed, and then the Gaussian process does this interpolation along with uncertainties right here. And what that allows you to do now is to have this approximate model. So previously the model looked like this. The original model looked like this. So it's your observation was your computer model plus some discrepancy plus some measurement error. Now the approximate model for the observations looks like what we had before, but this guy has been replaced by an approximation. Okay. Yes.
Murali, also a question from Eric Feigelson.
Sure.
Regarding, do you use Latin hypercubes to select the p parameter values for the emulator?
Yes, I have glossed over those. Correct. Yeah. And then I'm going to sort of I see now that in order to just give a bird's eye view of this, I'm going to skip some of the details so that this is not too rushed. But I just want to give you a quick sense here that the discrepancy model for delta here needs to be flexible enough so that it's adaptable to systematic differences, but it's not so flexible that it causes identifiability issues with the computer model. So if you make it extremely flexible, it makes it hard for you to learn about theta. So this is a very delicate and challenging problem as well. Okay. And so at the end of this whole process, we land up with something that looks like this. You have an approximate likelihood function where the approximation has to do with the fact that we replace the original computer model with this approximate computer, with the stochastic model. And that leads us to this approximate posterior distribution on which we're going to base our inference. So that's the conclusion. So we take our computer model. So now just to give you a sense of how this works for our observations. So if my observation were this value here, and with the errors sort of denoted by these dashed lines, then looking at this curve, looking at the data, the black dots here, and fitting an approximate computer model using Gaussian process, which gives us this red curve, we can then back out what kinds of values of the parameters are compatible with the values of that we see in the observational data. So so this is now, from here we can get a distribution on the parameter theta, right? And I'm going to skip this slide, except just to mention that often the data that we get are time series, non-Gaussian spatial data, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to actually handle those details. And I'm skipping all of that here. Instead, I'm just going to note the major challenge is that as the number of model parameter increases, emulation deteriorates. It's harder to find a design that will actually fill up the space enough to give you a good sense of what those parameter values will be that will not allow you to do a good job of approximating the computer model. So in our particular example, we considered just 4. And so a natural question to ask is, well, if you didn't fix all those other parameters, how would it have impacted your conclusions? And so this motivates the development of a different approach that I'm again going to just briefly walk through. So in this other approach, we reduce the resolution of the ice sheet model from 20 kilometers to 80 kilometers. So this allows us to run these things much more quickly. And then we use a sequential Monte Carlo approach that's amenable to parallelization, a massive parallelization. So here's a quick overview of how the sequential Monte Carlo works. So sequential Monte Carlo essentially uses a number of particles. So if you're familiar with importance sampling, take a large number of particles, and for each of those particles, you resample those particles according to a distribution such that you get draws that approximate a target. So you have an importance function. So that's how you sample the particles. Then you resample the particles according to a ratio between that importance function and the target function and the target distribution. And by doing that resampling, you end up getting an approximation to the target distribution. The idea of doing it this way is that each particle can essentially be run on a separate processor. And so you can massively parallelize this, and it avoids the sequential nature of the computing in a Markov-chain Monte Carlo algorithm. So let me just give you a quick picture. I think this picture can be useful. So the sequential Monte Carlo will start like this. So you start off with your particles on the far left, and then you find weights and you resample according to this importance sampling formula, such that you take those particles and you obtain this new set of particles that more closely resemble your target. Your target distribution is the posterior distribution that you're interested in. And by doing this resampling, you obtain this guy that's a little bit closer. And then you run small Markov chains on each of these particles to essentially get something that's perturbed, and you get a new set of particles for which then you restart this process again, where you do a reweight and resample, and then you repeat this process. So you get pi2, and then you repeat this process. So you move from pi1, which is your first stage target distribution, and by this mutation and weighted resampling, you keep moving closer and closer towards pi t, and this is the one that's your target. And by doing it this way, you get samples. It's a Monte Carlo approximations with respect to this distribution, but you've also allowed your this approach to be completely, really massively parallelized, because each particle lives on a different processor. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to my goal was to give an overview, as I said before. So I'm okay with skipping some of these details. There are lots of details on how the sequential Monte Carlo is constructed so that it works well. And I'm just going to cut to one interesting point that we found from the actual analysis. So we did extensive simulated examples and other things to verify that this approach was working well. But then we found out that because we have the luxury of studying more parameters and of actually studying this model as we run it much further back in time, we can study things like this marine ice cliff instability, which tells you something about how these subaerial ice cliffs, so these things that are just above ground, ice cliffs that exceed 90 meters in height, are likely to collapse under their own weight. So this is something that could lead to runaway ice sheet retreat. So if these things, this MICHI, this marine ice cliff instability, is something that can really impact how quickly the ice sheets retreat. And some of the parameters we're able to study in tandem with using data from the distant past, we're able to actually say a little bit more about the values of these parameters and how they're impacted by data from the Pliocene era. So this is just to wrap up here. If we use an emulation approach and just work with 3 parameters here, so that would give us the blue curve when we're looking at the Antarctic ice sheet contribution to sea level rise in the year 2300. But if we used our approach with all 11 parameters, you can see that it produces a much higher degree of uncertainty about the Antarctic ice sheet contribution to sea level rise. So this red curve here. And in particular, you can see that the tails, they looks very, very different. So it's a completely non-obvious, because these models there's so many non-linearities, and how the data come in to do the calibration is so non-trivial. It's not obvious to see how going from a 3-parameter model to going to the 11-parameter model might lead to very different kinds of uncertainties about your projections. So you actually need to be able to do it, right? And in order to do it, you need some of these computational approaches that let you study more parameters. And in line with Michael's statement before, if you add more uncertainties, there's lots of open questions about exactly what curves like this will look like. And quick note that all our conclusions depend heavily on the model, of course. And so we focus on parametric uncertainty. This is Michael's question. We ignore climate forcings, uncertainty, impact of including or excluding various observations, the impact of the resolution. We studied a little bit, but it's hard to really to know all of that in detail. So this is a hard problem. And we've learned a little bit about it by studying it, by developing new methods to study it in various ways. And here's a quick summary. So emulation calibration allows us to study more complex and computationally expensive models but we're limited in the number of parameters we can consider. So that's the emulation calibration part. And the fast particle-based approach that we have that I discussed briefly in the second part of this talk, it reduces wall times through massive parallelization and some other techniques that we added into the mix. And we can actually expand the number of parameters considered, and you see that you get somewhat different conclusions from this. And so what would we ultimately like? We'd like methods to increase the number of parameters considered plus the complexity increase the complexity of the model. That would be ideal, but I think it's worth noting that increased complexity may not always result in better models, because there's often that thinking that if you could only have more computing and more complexity, that you might get something that works much better, and that's not always the case. But and I think with that, I will just put up a few of the references, the key references and sources of support. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. I see we have a lot of questions in the chat box. We can, does the person who had the question want to take them? We have a question from Lorenz. Is the discrepancy in the model the same as a measurement error?
No. So the measurement error, they can kind of be somewhat they can be confounded if you're not careful about it. But the discrepancy, the way you want to think about a discrepancy, is something that is a systematic difference between what the model produces and what you see from the observation. So the thought experiment is that if you had no measurement error, right, or if you got lots of repeated estimates you got lots of replicates of your observations, and your measurement error was really, you had it under control, you would still not quite, there's no parameter setting theta for which that model is going to produce those observations, even if you had no measurement error. And in particular, all these scientists know that the model will systematically, screw up things for some of these climate models will screw up things on the poles in ways that it won't screw up by the equator. And you might want to adjust for the fact that that the model gets something systematically wrong. I don't know if that helps. But the thought experiment is, even if you observe things perfectly, the model is going to be systematically wrong. And the discrepancy is a model for how the model is systematically wrong. I hope that was helpful. It's
well, somewhat helpful, yes. Then we can think of it as a measure of model misspecification, perhaps.
Sure.
That may be closer to reality.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I see Grace Chiu has a question. Grace, would you like to ask directly? Okay, I can read. Oh.
I'm sorry, my audio wasn't quite working. Yeah, thanks, Murali, for a wonderful talk. I was just wondering, it seems like time-wise, your work, or at least the publications from your team on this, seem to kind of coincide with the time that some of the CSIRO folks were publishing on using emulation and SMC to model biogeochemical cycles. So I was just wondering if there might have been any kind of cross-pollination between the two groups.
No, this is honestly the first time hearing of it. So if there's any way you could send me a note that would point me to a key paper or two, or the group, so that
yeah, certainly I can send you some names.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
And Michael Stein has a question.
Yeah, Murali, so given that you have two models, have you tried doing some cross-fertilization between them? So first of all, you could ask if the low-res model reproduces the high-res model in the 3-parameter setting, but maybe more interesting, you could take one or a small number of the settings from the low-res model where you got a lot of melting, and try to confirm if you just run the high-resolution model at just those settings, which wouldn't have to run thousands, you just have to run a handful. You could see does that conclusion hold up under the high-res model? So you use the low-res model to explore parameter space, and you use the high-res model to hopefully get more accurate answers where you see interesting results.
Yeah, that's a very nice way to explore this. So the former student now, Ben Lee and I, Ben who led this work, we've had lots of conversations about how, I don't know if reconcile is the right word for it, but how we sort of reconcile the two different sets of results we've gotten from this work and the previous work, and part of the issue has been to the lead ice sheet modeler on this just retired, so we're going to have to figure out a way to see if we can get interested in continue on this. But the idea you gave is a very nice specific area. We were thinking about several other ways of doing this as well.
Okay, I see that Katie Dagan has a question.
Yeah, thanks for the really nice talk. My question is about parameter selection, sort of initially, how you determined the important parameters in the model, and also parameter prior distribution. So you talked about Latin hypercube sampling or in response to a question, but what about the bounds of the parameters? Because I've found with calibration work that selecting the bounds is can be very sensitive to the calibration results.
Yes, this is true. And I think that may be in one of the slides that I glossed over a little bit, where, so the priors for the parameters definitely, and also the choice of parameters, the choice of parameters, there's no substitute for having experts tell you which ones to focus on. And they actually do this quite well, because it's very common for them to limit, if they're not using emulation or they're not using some of these sequential Monte Carlo type techniques, they definitely face severe limitations in how many runs they can do. So they are constantly making decisions like this. So they have really excellent ideas based both on their understanding of the physics as well as their experience in running the model. So they have excellent ideas for which ones are most important. What I think can be more tricky is actually the prior specification for each of those, which they have ideas, but as we all know, translating some sense of what you think would be reasonable values to probability distributions is tricky at best. And so our solution is really to try to come up with something that is reasonable, and then mess with it a little bit, make it wider, make it narrower, move it around a little bit, and just see what kind of, how the results change. But that's really the best we can do. But you're right, all of those things matter. To some extent, the choice of parameters is such a big deal, as I demonstrated here, and it's completely not obvious how you can go from just taking a few parameters to adding a few more. It's not obvious how projections and other things translate at all.